indie breakout success stories with writer-director David Lowery. He is the man behind Ain't Them Body Saints. It's a film that played the Sundance Film Festival, made its debut there in January, went on to play Cannes and several other festivals. And it was in competition for the Grand Jury Prize at Sundance.
Yeah.
And ultimately walked away with Best Cinematography for Bradford Young. For how many people here managed to see the film yesterday or on another occasion? Okay, a few, so we'll kind of paint a picture for them. It's a film that in some senses follows in the tradition of films like Badlands and Bonnie and Clyde, kind of young outlaws on the run. Except the thing that differentiates it somewhat is that it ends where it begins rather,
yeah.
the other one. It begins where those other films end. It has a shootout very early in the film, in which we see Bob, played by Casey Affleck, and Ruth, played by Rooney Mara, kind of making their last stand against the police. And instead of going out in a blaze of glory, they find themselves with Bob in custody. Ruth is allowed to go free to raise their daughter, who has not yet been born at this point. And as the film progresses, Bob tries to find his way back to her.
That's a fantastic encapsulation of...
Okay. Should we, since there are some people that haven't seen it as of yet, should we try to take a look at a clip and give them a sense of that opening sequence?
If we can make it work.
Sumit, do you think we can?
There's been a rife with technical difficulties with these clips.
Yes, there is.
It's almost as if it's cursed.
But okay. John, could you show the DVD from the booth?
You want to set up with it all?
Well, this is the...
This is that shootout that happens in the first 3 minutes of the movie. And this really is pretty much the beginning. I mean, it's not the exact beginning of the movie, but it's very much the opening sequence. And, you know, there's no titles at the beginning, but if there were, there should be a pre-title. And so it's basically like the final stand of two young outlaws who have been on the run for an undetermined amount of time and are finally reached the end of, basically, as you said, where most movies would end is where this movie begins.
And I think it begins with you said there's no title at the beginning, but it does say...
This was in Texas.
This was in Texas, which kind of gives it a slightly fairy tale quality.
Yeah, exactly.
And you see them having that kind of, how outlaws would want to go out.
Yeah, exactly.
But then they're deprived that. And I think the film kind of continues to undercut expectations in some regard thereafter.
Precisely.
When you decided that the film was going to begin this way, or what was the beginning stages for the film yourself? Like, what was the first image that came to you, or the first scene? And then when did you make the decision to sequence it as you did?
The first image was a guy breaking out of prison, but it wasn't a prison break. It was a guy, I knew he was breaking out of prison, but the image was a man walking out of the woods. And that image is in the movie, like exactly as I initially envisioned it. And I just wanted, I always liked the idea of like having a single image that can represent an entire event. And so this was a case where this guy was going to break out of prison and set off across the countryside to reunite with his family in a very Odyssey style, you know, adventure. And I wanted to like distill that down to one image, and the image was this tiny figure emerging from the woods and covered in mud and muck, and so that was the first image, and I think I initially thought I'd write like a more traditional like action movie, like it was gonna be like a kind of Southern action movie, and I just, you know, along the same lines of distilling, you know, an entire prison break sequence into a single image, I kind of got rid of all of the other action too. And did the lights just change? Whoa, I think there might be a video. There's a lot of darkness in this movie.
Something to talk about.
Bob Jack Hunt.
We can make it if we run.
You told me you were scared and I put it there. And we had a blink. And I'm gonna come back. All you gotta do is wait for me. I promise I'll come get you. Just wait for me. Just wait for me.
And
See. Let me tell you, if anyone ever suggests this is the best place to watch a movie from, this chair right here, they are wrong. But this is your third feature that you've directed.
I would say second.
Second? Okay.
Yeah.
We're not going to count. Not going to count Lullaby. Not
Dead
Room.
Well, that was like short films.
Okay.
It was a collection of shorts.
Yeah. Oh, it was okay.
Yeah.
So second feature. You've worked extensively as an editor, though.
Yep.
I think over 30 credits as an editor. I'm wondering, a suggestion I had heard once for screenwriters was to take an improv class because it kind of gives an idea of how actors have to respond to situations. And it also gives them an idea of how to troubleshoot at a given point in time.
Mm-hmm.
If they ever write themselves in a corner, you kind of open up these whole new thought processes that wouldn't readily occur to a writer.
That's a brilliant
necessarily.
idea.
And I wonder, do you think that that writers could be well served by taking some time in the editing bay as well? And for yourself, how does kind of doing double duty as an editor affect how you tell stories and structure your stories?
Well, to answer the first part of that question, it might help writers, but editing is it's its own thing, and I can imagine, that if you're not inclined to participate in that part of the filmmaking process, it could be very frustrating and not enlightening. As it's just such a weird technical part of it. It's an art form, like an incredibly important art form in and of itself, but it's also just such a solitary and weirdly technical thing that unless someone had an inclination to do it, I don't know if I'd recommend that they learn how. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it certainly is, and then that leads into the second part of the question, which is it certainly has served me immensely. And now I love editing. When I first started learning how to make films, I taught myself how to do everything, and that was the thing that stuck the most. Like that was the thing I enjoyed the most, and I liked it. I liked that process, and it was a lot of fun, and I got decent enough at it to make a living at it, and not a good living though, but a decent living. And the thing that came of that is that once you're in that mindset of this is the final stage of the filmmaking process, so to speak. They say you write a movie 3 times. You write it, you shoot it, and then you edit it. And this is the final one of those. And being, so entrenched in that process naturally affects how you approach the previous 2 versions of writing, one of which is writing in and of itself. And so you think now having spent so much time editing other movies and my own, when I'm sitting down to write a new script, I'm automatically thinking about how is it going to cut together? How is it going to, how's one scene going to lead into the next? How is the scene that happens at the beginning going to resonate with the scene that happens at the end? Or how, all the things that, kind of are going to happen no matter what when you cut a movie together, because a lot of times you just find serendipitous happy accidents, but you can't help but think about those when you're writing, and also about pace and about how how fast or how slow you want a scene to play out, and you start building things in the script that will suggest exactly how that pace will play out on set and on screen and so on and so forth, and it's really helpful most of the time. On set, if someone says, well, why are you only covering the scene from these 2 angles? You can say, well, here's why. I'm going to cut it together in this fashion. Mm-hmm. Every now and then you get to the editing room and be like, why did I only do 2 angles? I need this close-up. Why? I'm such an idiot. So you shoot yourself in the foot every now and then, but more often than not, it's helpful. And it really is, it's useful in showing that you know what you want, like because you do. You have an idea of the end product that's very clear, and you can communicate to your collaborators, whether they're the crew or the cast or whoever it is, exactly what it is going to wind up looking in a much more, immediate fashion, rather than saying, well, we're going to have, we're going to cover this scene from 6 different angles and it'll cut together somehow. You say, well, we're going to do a close-up, we're going to do a wide shot, and we're only going to do the wide shot through this part because after that we're just going to do the close-ups for the rest of the scene. You can say things like that, and it helps them understand what it is that they're doing, what they're working towards, and that's really beneficial. And it is something that I don't think working as an editor, I certainly wouldn't recommend that all directors cut their films, because then I would have been out of work. But it definitely, once, if you have the knack for it and if you like it, I can't imagine going back to, not having your hands in the edit, whether or not you work with somebody or not. Like, it's something that, for me, is part of the process that is most enjoyable and the most fun, and the, I always describe it as alchemy, because you're really taking a bunch of disparate elements and all of a sudden they turn into something new, and it's really fantastic and exciting.
Well, I suppose the writing process itself is very solitary, much like the editing process. So it allows you to kind of bookend the experience as well, beyond the collaborative portion of it. Do you think that, having worked with footage so much before, does it make scenes and passages of dialogue maybe less precious to you in the writing stage? Are you able to kind of excise those things more readily?
I'm trying to get better about not excising them, because yes, I do. I cut things to the core, to a fault, I think. And it was, it's funny watching this movie. Like, I can see where I'm like, I could have used a little bit more in there. I was really cutting it to the bone, just thinking, what do I not need, and getting rid of it in advance. And I think there's places where it could use a little more. It's funny how far I erred on that side. Yeah. It really is, they have that famous saying, you always want to kill your babies. And when we got to the editing room, I was so conscientious of that anything that wasn't working in the slightest, I was just cutting out. And so the first cut of the movie, was really short, because I just cut I was like, I can't be attached to anything. I don't want to be precious about anything. I'm just going to cut anything that seems to, be excessive or anything. And it was ridiculous. Like, everybody was laughing. I went so far the opposite direction because I was so conscientious of it. But it does help. Like, it does, when I'm writing a script, I can think, in advance, like, this is a great monologue, but this is never, or a great scene, or a great whatever, but it's never going to make the final cut, and I can just, get rid of it.
You had mentioned kind of building in some of those pauses and elements of mood at the script stage. It's perhaps, you have the benefit of shooting your own script.
Yeah.
So you have again, you know how it's going to be cut together. For people in the room who might be screenwriters primarily, when you read scripts, is there something that, do you think you can write mood on the page or convey mood on the page, given the kind of spare form that most screenplays take, or what would you recommend in that regard?
I like to do that. I mean, but as soon as you do that, you're starting to cross over into a more literary format, which is kind of, it's not dangerous, but the script, no one's going to read the script when after the movie's made, and hopefully, like, I always like to not look at it once we start shooting, even, like, kind of just throw it away at that point. But I like to, I love literature, and I like to write scripts that read well and that are, that suggest what the movie's going to be like. And so you can use, language to set the mood in the same way that you would in a novel, and you hopefully can do it more efficiently. You're not going to write a whole paragraph to set up a scene, but you can use a few words. Or the thing that I like to do a lot of times is just, use the spacing between lines or things like that, or use punctuation to really emphasize like a pace or a rhythm or a mood more so than the words themselves, because those are the things that, as you're reading it, oftentimes when you always hear that people read scripts and just read the dialogue and skim through the action, and so you make the action as minimal as possible, but the way you space it out, I think, can help establish what it is that you're after in that scene and in the script as a whole. And then just, you don't want to get too word heavy, but I try to, be somewhat literate with what I'm writing and really try to capture the tone of the scene and the mood of a scene in a few short words or a few short lines.
Excellent. And obviously, as we heard in the clip, the music in the film, it's very, very evocative, and I think you've accomplished something impressive in that the music is almost omnipresent in the film.
Yeah.
And yet it never becomes oppressive. And when it does cut out, because so many people haven't seen the film, we won't say specifically when, but it's during moments of realization for these characters, or sometimes the key points when there's a sense of clarity for them, where they realize the reality of their circumstances, and kind of that fairy tale spell is broken a little bit.
Yep.
What were some of the conversations you had with your composer about how to find that right balance where it could really add a propulsive rhythm and mood to it, but was still kind of almost like this undercurrent?
It was interesting how little we actually talked about it. It was, we cut the movie really, really fast. And Daniel Hart, the composer, was writing the score as we were cutting it. And so, like, as soon as we had like 15 minutes to send him, I sent him the first 15 minutes of the movie, which were at that point really, really rough, not really resembling what we just watched. But he sent back a piece of music that was remarkably well defined and a very, he played all the instruments himself, so it was very, a complete piece of score. And we put that into the movie, and it was so good that we started recutting the opening to that piece, and that kind of like ended up being how we went through the whole process, where he would send us stuff, we'd put it in the edit, reshape the edit, send it back to him, and it was we just moved hand in hand through the whole film. And he wrote enough score to there's like an hour worth of music we didn't use because we were editing. There were scenes that got cut out of the movie that he had music for. There was just so much material he wrote, and I never thought really about how much there was going to be or how prominent it was going to be. It just sort of we'd just put it in. If it would feel right, we'd go with it. And if it started to feel like we'd watch the movie and we would have it all rough cut together, do a rough cut screening, and be like, oh, there's too much music, and let's dial it back. And it was just kind of like feeling our way through it. And on a scene-by-scene basis, I would say things like, okay, this is too bombastic, or it needs to be more delicate, or it needs to be more bombastic, or things like that. But then once we, would watch the movie as a whole, that's when we'd start paring it back. And there were always things like silences, like when they got separated there in that clip, like that was always going to be there. But there were lots of other scenes where we put music in, and it was just too much, or where there wasn't music and we decided we needed some, and it was just kind of just, I always describe it abstractly as just fumbling through and just feeling our way through and just seeing what felt right. And the music really became like the backbone of the movie. Like you were saying, like the whole movie has this sort of surreal fairy tale quality to it. And every now and then I wanted to break that. And that's when the music goes away. But the rest of the time, it's there. And it was something I was worried about because my first movie had no music in it at all except for like a 5-minute sequence, which Daniel also wrote. And I really wanted to just let the natural sounds be sort of the score to the film. And so here I was going in the opposite direction, and I was really worried about getting like too manipulative or just too oppressive, as you said. And so we were really just very conscious of like whenever we'd watch it, like is it feeling too much? Is it feeling like we're just drowning in music? And if we ever got to that point, we'd dial back. And it's a really tricky balance because like sometimes we'd watch it like we'd recut the ending of the movie. Like, okay, well, let's watch the second half of the film, and we'd watch it, and everything would feel good. And then you'd watch the whole thing, and all of a sudden you realize there's a piece of music that when you watch the whole thing straight through, all of a sudden it changes how the music that originally felt great works. So it was a balancing act all the way through, but it really began to. I like to think of it as like the backbone, the nervous system of the movie, because it's really just. It doesn't so much tell you how to feel. I think that's the movie does that by itself, but it just accentuates those feelings in a very precise way.
Are you someone who listens to a lot of music when you write?
I usually sit down to write and start to, and then if I don't have like my iPod on or whatever, my iTunes on like shuffle or whatever, like once the album reaches its end, I'll forget to put something else on. So I start off listening to music, and then by the end of the day, it's all just silence.
Yeah. Do you find it helps you kind of establish a rhythm, maybe, or just kind of gets you going in the beginning? Or?
Sometimes. I
Yeah.
mean, I know that there are probably writers who like make playlists and listen to very specific things, and for me, it's not so much a matter of getting in the mood. I mean, that's going to happen regardless. It's more just to keep me occupied, some little area of my brain occupied. I have a really short attention span, and having music helps me focus. But that's not to say that music's not important in the development of my work, because I think this movie was inspired more by music than anything else. And so I would be thinking about music a lot, even if I wasn't necessarily listening to it.
Well, I think it was maybe your Q&A yesterday. A friend was telling me that you said that you kind of wanted the movie to unfold a bit like a folk song, or
yeah, I really wanted. I love just folk, like American folklore, and the way the folk tradition, and that goes beyond just America, like the oral tradition in general, the way a story can last and endure, and be through the telling of it, and change, but always still remain sort of the same. And that's something, that I've long been fascinated by. And my approach with this movie was I wanted to make a movie that felt like it was a song that Johnny Cash would have covered, but was much older than that.
Yeah.
Something from like turn of the century, but that kept just persisting throughout history, and that people kept singing over and over again. And so it was meant to feel very familiar and yet slightly new at the same time.
Well, I think it's an odd film in a sense, because we see, or from my viewing experience of it was odd, because we see the police cars, there's the car chase right at the very beginning, and yet almost every time in the film that I see an automobile from the early 1960s, it still seems kind of shocking. Like it feels like the film could exist in a time before automobiles were on the roads.
Yeah.
And it is almost jarring, even though it's a period piece. It feels like it is from a time even earlier than the film is set.
We definitely tried to make it. I mean, if you were to ask anyone while we were making it what year this movie takes place, and everyone would be like, "Oh, it's 1976," because that was what we decided for the newspapers, because we had to have prop newspapers. But the idea was to really blend time periods and make it feel like it was indeed older than the 1970s. So the vehicles, for example, range from 1983 to 1959, I think, and all the clothing is, some of it is from the 40s. All the police uniforms are accurate to the 70s, and those haven't really changed that much. But everything else is like, we just tried to make it look as old as possible. And then the three bad guys who show up at one point look like they're out of a John Ford Western, and really, it was it was something that developed out of, you know, going location scouting to these small towns in Texas and realizing that none of them have really changed in the past 60 years, and that you can kind of feel like, you know, it's unclear what time period you're in when you visit these places. And then we decided to take that to like a slightly more surreal level and really make the movie unstuck in time.
I think it's a nice touch as well, having the police be the only real uniforms that are contemporary to the film.
Yeah,
Because it
yeah.
kind of accentuates the outlaw quality to all the other characters.
Completely.
They're not adhering to the chronology of the film.
Especially
whatsoever.
because the movie's like suggesting that that way of life is not gonna last. Like
Yeah.
these characters are on their way out and their story's done, and so, you know, it helps that they feel from a different era.
Well, you mentioned some location scouting that you were doing in Texas, and you know, there's much talk about this golden age of television that we're in, and it seems that one thing that it has been discussed to some degree, but is like the regions that these television shows are taking us into, be it New Mexico and Breaking Bad, or Kentucky and Justified, and it seems like there is kind of this newfound interest in, and part of this is for production reasons, but also just these areas of America that maybe haven't graced either the small or big screen in a long time. And last year, kind of the big breakout hit from Sundance was Beasts of the Southern Wild. This year, Jeff Nichols' Mud, and he had a film in Sundance prior as well, is one of the highest grossing indie films of all time. Do you have a sense of what is kind of propelling this kind of renewed interest in stories told in the southern states?
You know, I think it's not so much a matter of like wanting to tell stories there. I can't speak to television as much, but in the case of Jeff, who I know, and Ben Zeitlin, who I also know, it's just making stories in places you know. And Jeff is a great example of that because he, you know, grew up in Arkansas, and that's the world he's familiar with. So his first movie took place there. Take Shelter was shot somewhere else, but was supposed to take place there. And then Mud, he was, you know, right back there on the Mississippi. And Ben Zeitlin isn't from New Orleans, but he'd moved there, and just that was the world he got to know and wanted to tell stories there. And then for me, Texas is just where I grew up, and that's where I still live, and it just made sense to make movies there. And at a certain point, you know, especially with this film, it became like kind of a central character in the movie as well as the backdrop. And I don't know if there's any reason other than that people are, you know, able now to make movies away from the coasts, and that's refreshing and exciting, and I like seeing people tell stories that take place in a world that they know. I think that's important, and it adds a degree of, like, you know, it makes everything more personal when you're making something that's in your backyard, so to speak, and so I don't know if there's any, you know, cultural reasoning behind it other than that people are, you know, more apt now to not move to New York or LA and just to make films where they are comfortable.
You moved to Texas at a young age, is that right? Do you think that you still kind of maintain like that the first time you saw like those wide open Texas plains and such, is there still some of that for you? Like you still kind of marvel at the landscapes there?
You know, the funny thing is, I was born in Wisconsin and moved to Texas when I was 7, and at first I hated it. Like I loved the snow and I loved cold weather, and I'd forsaken both of those things when I moved to Texas, and it took me a while to actually really realize that it was a pretty remarkable place to live. And you know, the first thing when I first moved there, before I'd ever gotten there, I was assuming it was going to just all be desert and cactuses and cowboys and like the usual cliches. And of course, it's not that at all. I mean, there's certainly that in some places, but Texas is a big enough place to where you can have pretty much any sort of landscape you want, depending on what part of the state you're in. And so we were in North Texas, where there's none of that really. And then it wasn't until I was, you know, in high school that I started to actually notice how cool the state was, and to appreciate it and to identify with it. And so it's more, I marvel at it more now than I ever did before. Like now, like as I get older, I appreciate it more and more, and want to stay there more and more. Well,
I think in addition to the American outlaw tradition, which in some ways has been played out a fair number of times this year in films. I think both yours and then even something like Spring Breakers is kind of an outlaw movie
Yeah,
in a
it's true.
sense. You know, it's a very
Yeah.
different type of outlaw film, and even something like Sofia Coppola's The Bling
Bling
Ring.
Ring, yeah.
Yeah, they're kind of like this trifecta of outlaw films.
And Mud too, for that
Yeah,
matter.
it's very true. And do you think is that a response to the economy right now? Do you think there's kind of this renewed interest in the outlaw story?
That is for other people to apply to, for, at least with my film. Like I can't put that sort of categorization on it. It certainly wasn't on my mind on a conscious way while I was working on it, but I've read reviews that have mentioned that. I was like, that's a really interesting take on it, and I would never have thought of that, but that is certainly a valid perspective, and that's one of the great, luxuries I have from where I'm sitting as the filmmaker, which is that I make it, and I've got my own reasoning behind things and my own intentions, and I love to see what other people see in it, and there's no discounting any theory or anything. One of my favorite quotes that Robert Altman ever had was that everything in a movie is legitimately readable into-ish, and I think that's true. Like you can sort of just whether or not something was consciously done or overtly done or purposefully done, there's so much going on screen, and it's such a malleable format, a malleable medium that that everything is valid. So I don't put it in any sort of box, or I don't put anything other than the few things that I dare say that I intended to do. I might talk about those every now and then, but I just like to hear what other people take out of it.
Well, one of the things I really enjoy about it, and I think I have a softness for this in films myself, is stories about characters who are telling their own stories within that story. And you have that with Bob, who I think is played really wonderfully by Casey Affleck. And I think he has that quality as an actor where there is like a certain fragility to him almost, and you can tell that he's willing to invest himself in like the stories he's spinning for himself. And it reminded me of his role in The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which really rolls off the tongue. But again, there's this element of a character desperately wanting to write their own legend.
Absolutely.
And like that plays into the folkloric thing you were saying earlier. And do you think that is part of? It seems like an oddly North American thing to me, to kind of like want to write your own destiny, and kind of stand in the face of the fates, and then often in cases the fates win out at the end, and these characters are surprised when it happens. But until that point in time, they're willing to fight to the last to write their own history.
I'm not enough of a historian to say whether that's accurate or not, but I think it is. I think it is. It is specifically North American and very true to American culture, and that is one of the things that that I like about. I like. I mean, whether it's good or bad that people do that for the different reasons they might. I think that's a really fascinating trait and a really fascinating thing you can give a character to do, and that was definitely something that was always intended from the very beginning, was that Bob is someone he's a storyteller, and the subject of his stories are generally himself, and he really is trying to live up to what the myths he spins about himself, and the hubris of his characters is that he's trying to do that, and the tragedy of it is that he can't.
It may not be giving too much away, but you mentioned that one of the first images that came to you was Bob just freshly broken out of prison, trying to find his way back to his family. And yet we never see the jailbreak in the film. We see it cuts and he is out by the side of the highway trying to find his way back.
Yeah.
And was that kind of an idea you had of kind of how to undercut the legend that he writes of himself?
Yeah, absolutely. And then 5 minutes later, you hear him tell his own story of how he broke out, and I was always much more interested in hearing that than seeing it. Like I felt that if we saw it, it would undercut the myth he builds for himself, and that's like one of those moments where you can sit back and imagine all of the it's a lengthy scene. It's like 5 or 6 minutes of him just telling the story of how he got out. And it's ridiculous and clearly not true, but that's more valuable to the film and to me as a viewer than to actually see whatever it was that might have happened.
Speaking about the casting of the film, I understand that actually Keith Carradine was one of the actors. Keith Carradine plays kind of a mentor figure to Bob
Yeah.
and Ruth. He was one of the actors you were most happy to secure for the film.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, not only is he just a phenomenal actor and a wonderful person, but you know, when you're casting an older character like that who's supposed to have like a presence in the movie, I like the idea that you can utilize an actor's history to the movie's benefit. And I think that's not right for every movie, but when it can be utilized, you know, I think that's a wonderful luxury you can fall back on. And to have Keith Carradine, whose first movie was McCabe and Mrs. Miller, and then did Thieves Like Us, and all these classic, you know, 70s films, especially those two, I think that this is like all of those performances kind of resonate in this character that he's playing now, who's an older version perhaps of those characters if they hadn't died in those movies. but he was someone that when I first wrote the part, I was like, that'd be so cool to get him, because I didn't even think about the fact that he had matured into this, you know, sort of magisterial presence until I saw Deadwood, and then he plays Wild Bill in that show and just owns the screen in such a wonderful way. Because in those old the 70s movies, he was such a young kid, and then for various reasons we weren't able to get the script to him at first, and we sought out other actors, and then none of that worked out, and then at a certain point I was like, wait, why don't we just go back to Keith and see if he's available now? And he was, and drove his RV to the set and showed up and knocked it out of the park, and it was a dream come true to work with him.
And I think we'll take a look at a clip in a moment, but maybe you can speak about Rooney Mara and what she brought to the role of Ruth, as we've discussed Casey and Keith.
She is, you know, I think perceived as a mystery, which is great for this character, because the character is, I mean, she's as a person is perceived as a very mysterious actress, and I think she, you know, she's very private and very quiet and doesn't like to do interviews or things like that, and she, but she's an incredibly warm and wonderful person when you get to know her, and I wanted to have a character who is on guard at all times. Like, she's, you know, we catch up with her 4 years after that scene we watched, and she's been raising this child on her own and is trying to, you know, find a way to fit into society, and there's, you know, not to give anything away, but she's like harboring a secret that doesn't really play out in a major way, but the fact that she shot a police officer, and that's what Bob went to prison for, or one of the things he went to prison for that he took the rap for, she's like got that guilt with her, and there's so much going on in her head at all times, but she's like always just containing it and not letting anyone inside to really know what she's thinking or feeling. And Rooney was able to actually just like really take what was on the page, a very opaque character who it's hard to get a read on, and make that struggle omnipresent in her face, in her movements, everything she's doing, and that was a real like just masterclass in watching an actor work. Every time we'd call action, and she would just turn it on, and it would be amazing to see. Anyway, we can watch a clip of her acting. Maybe.
I think it's happening.
The station. And it's gonna be all over the news later. What best do you hear this time, friend?
Hear what?
I've tried to escape 5 times already. Did you know that?
No, sir.
Well, maybe 6 times is the charm. The boys he broke free with got caught trying to hop a train up near Bartlesville, heading north. Maybe Bob's doing likewise. Maybe he's already long gone.
Maybe.
What do you think?
I don't know.
Any asking about him, anybody at all.
No.
What about those letters?
Everyone read them before they even got sent. They don't say anything.
You want to just bring him in anyway?
I'll do whatever you want. But he won't come back. He's not coming back for me if that's what you're thinking.
So we'll, are we back up? I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'll ask you for more questions, and we'll
Yeah.
open it up to the Q&A. Just as we are at a festival right now, your previous film, St. Nick, I mean, I guess with this film you got to experience what is kind of the dream for many a North American filmmaker of premiering it at Sundance. But the previous film played smaller festivals and enjoyed a lot of success. I think it won at St. Louis and
Somewhere else.
yeah, Dallas and Birmingham won top prizes at all three. And wondering, do you feel that kind of the experience on that maybe the smaller rung or second tier of festivals helped you get traction in order to make this film a reality?
I mean, I think so. I mean, we premiered St. Nick at South by Southwest, which was a great place to start off, and then it played all over the country. It went to, all over the world for that matter. It played at festivals for like 3 years, and it never went to Sundance or Cannes, but it did a lot of other it got a lot of exposure, and that definitely helped. You know, even if people didn't see it, like they just were, there was an awareness of it that definitely helped get a little bit of traction. And I mean, I think every little thing helps. Like I think, you know, if someone mentioned it, Twitter, I don't know if Twitter even existed at that point, but if someone mentioned it somewhere, like just the fact that you know, the title of the movie or the fact that I'd made it was floating out there, like you know, I feel like that all just cumulatively helps, and it doesn't matter how big or how small something is, it's always helpful and always helps you get, you know, take that next step. And more so than that film, I think this short film I made after that called Pioneer was the one that really sort of got this movie going, because that movie, I shot it in 2 days in 2010, and it was sort of just something that I wrote on a whim when I had writer's block working on Ain't the Bloody Saints, and we shot it, and then that got into Sundance, and people loved it. Like that movie that short film did really, really well, and about as well as a short film could probably do, short of like getting an Oscar or something. And it, you know, was something that when it came time to getting the cast for this movie, we would send that short out with the script, and people would read it and watch that, and I think that helped convince them that I knew at least somewhat what I was doing. And so, but St. Nick sort of paved the way for that film. So everything, like, you know, everything sort of just builds as it needs to the, you know, and I mean, this film will help me get my next film made. So it's always just, you know, hopefully you're always just moving forward and never plateauing.
Well, we can open it up to questions from the crowd at this point, right here. Oh, there's a microphone coming down as well.
We need you to use it, please. Camera, right?
Anything I can do for you? A simple, stupid question. What was your budget and how did you get the financing?
The budget was a little bit north of $3 million, which my last feature, St. Nick, was $12,000. So it was a big jump forward, but you know, I wrote it thinking that I was going to make it for like $50,000. So it was just luck that that happened. And one of the things that happened was getting the cast together helped, certainly. And then we had a producer who read the script, and he was like, you know, if these actors sign on, I can put together this financing. So it kind of happened simultaneously, and he just got, you know, 3 partners, private equity, and that was it. It was all independently financed. But
The actors were the key.
yeah, absolutely. I think they, you know, if they hadn't signed on, we would be making the much less expensive version, which would have looked the same. It just wouldn't have had the same cast.
How much of the budget did they represent?
Not much. I mean, they all cut their rate. You know, I don't know how much they all make normally, but they didn't make very much on this movie. Like, no one did.
Well, I think there's something there as well, where this film, maybe not for $12,000, but could have been made for much less money
Yeah.
under different circumstances. So was that something you kind of thought about going in, that there are various thresholds that you could do this much more with the film, but it was still manageable at a very low price point?
We certainly, like, when my collaborators and my two producers that I always work with, we put together like initially like 3 budgets. We had like our 100,000, our 300,000, and our 700,000. We were thinking, okay, one of those 3 will happen, and then it wound up. And then at a certain point, we're like, oh, this might be. Like when actors started getting interested, we're like, okay, maybe we could do it for like 1 or 1.2, but we don't want to go more than that. And then the 3 just came together. It was sort of arbitrary. Like I could talk about why 3 is actually a terrible budget all day long, but but it got to that stage, and the funny thing is, like, I think that had we made it for less, the movie would have been largely the same. It wouldn't have been shot on 35 millimeter, and it wouldn't have been. Certainly wouldn't have had the cast, but the $100,000 version would have still been the same. It would have felt the same.
That's great. Here.
What did you shoot it on? Also, the film has a relatively dark look, and is that intentional? Is this print? Oh, we're seeing it representative of your coloring and timing of the final product.
I would say that this is not. This is a DVD that is like very low res.
Yeah, it's a screener DVD.
We tried to show a better copy, but we were having all sorts of technical issues with it. But the movie is very dark. That was intentional. Like, the movie is an incredibly dark film, and in fact, when it comes out on DVD, I'm putting color bars on it so people can calibrate, because like there are scenes in it that are intentionally really dark, but it would be easy for them to just slip into darkness completely if on certain televisions. The film was shot on Super 35. And we tried to make it as old-fashioned as possible, and so it was, shooting on film with old lenses, and we used only old lights or no fluorescent lights. So we really wanted it to feel like, much like we were talking about earlier, like something that existed in a different time period.
Question here.
At what stage of the creation of this project, whether in writing or after that, stepping into directing, did you have an idea of who you wanted to play these characters?
It was very late in the game. I had originally thought that I would cast it with just some friends that I knew who were actors, and that was going to be the low-budget version. And as soon as we had an opportunity to go out to a bigger cast, I was like, well, Casey would be great for Bob. That was like the first person, and I thought that if he didn't want to do it, Ben Foster would be a great second option. And they both liked the script and ultimately both wound up in it. And with Ruth, who Rooney plays, I was pretty certain that I wanted someone who was unknown. I didn't want like a movie star in that role. And her name came up, and it was right before Girl with the Dragon Tattoo came out. And she sort of was the best of both worlds, because she was perceived as a movie star because of this movie that she was about to be in, but no one had any idea what she actually looked like. So it really was a fantastic, best of both worlds scenario. But that was 5 months before we started shooting, so it was very, very late in the game. And I mean, I didn't know it was late in the game at that point, because I didn't realize we'd be shooting in 5 months. But it just all came together like very, very quickly.
I think that was our last question. The film does play again tomorrow at the Rio Theater at 9 p.m., so you're all encouraged to go and see it. It's a wonderful film and a remarkable achievement. I want to thank David Lowery for joining us today.
Thank you all for coming out.